Wallsend, on the north bank of the Tyne, a few minutes before 9 in the evening, autumn 1938. Sub-Officer George Renwick, 38, Newcastle City Fire Brigade, 7 years covering the Riverside yards from the Walker substation, was standing at the foot of the staging, looking up at a hull that was not yet a ship. It was frames and plating, 3/4 closed in, wrapped in timber scaffold from the keel blocks to the deck edge, and somewhere above the third staging platform, a welder's spark had found the varnish store that should not have been where it was. Renwick did not know yet where the seat was. What he knew was how to find out. A part-built hull had no doors, no corridors, no numbered rooms. It had frame numbers, and the yard's own shipwrights knew which frame led to which opening better than any fire brigade plan ever could. He had learned, over 6 previous yard fires on this stretch of river, that the first thing to establish was not where the fire was, but which way a man went if he needed to get out of that hull in the dark. The yard foreman was already coming down the plank gangway toward him. Renwick had 30 seconds to ask him the one question that mattered before the crew went up the scaffold. Period Fire magazine coverage of yard-adjacent brigades in this decade documents pumping appliances routinely working from riverside hydrant mains, where mains pressure was supplemented by yard-owned hydrant systems, a detail relevant to what Renwick's crew could rely on once they reached the staging. What was Renwick's one question to the yard foreman before he sent his crew up the scaffold into a hull with no fixed layout? And what had 6 previous Wallsend attendances taught him that the brigade's own training had never been built to cover? The Dennis Big Four that Renwick's crew brought to the Wallsend gate that evening was, by the standard of Newcastle City Fire Brigade's fleet in this decade, the brigade's principal riverside appliance. An open braidwood-bodied pump with a rear-mounted turbine capable, on period Dennis specifications for this class of engine, of delivering in the region of 350 to 400 gallons a minute. It was not, on its own, an appliance built for a ship. It was built for a street, a warehouse, a terrace, a building with a floor plan, walls that stayed where they were put, and a front door. What the Dennis could deliver was water, and enough of it, provided the crew could get a line to where the fire actually was. What it could not do was tell Renwick where that was. On a hull with no numbered rooms, the pump's rated output was only as useful as the route the hose took to reach the seat, and that route, on a part-built vessel, changed with every yard, every launch, every stage of construction. Newcastle City Fire Brigade covered these yards on a watch system built for the city's terraces and warehouses. The riverside crews at Walker had, over successive postings, built a working supplement to that training that the brigade's own manual had never formally required. Knowledge of how the yards themselves were laid out, obtained from the yard's own foreman rather than from any fire station record. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the British Fire Brigade between 1900 and 1980. The appliance, the building, the knowledge that the officer had built from previous attendances, and the community that depended on that knowledge before smoke detectors and sprinklers changed what fire could do before the crew arrived. Not spectacle. The documented operational intelligence of a fire brigade that protected communities built from industrial premises that burned in specific ways that specific people had learned to read. What 7 years of Wallsend yard attendances gave Sub-Officer Renwick was not in the Dennis Big Four's pump rating or the training manual. It was the specific knowledge of which frame numbers on a part-built hull led back to open air, and what happened to that knowledge when hot work permits and fire watch rules took the guesswork out of the yards after the war. And if you served in the fire brigade in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you or your family worked in the Tyneside shipyards, or served with Newcastle City Fire Brigade covering the riverside yards at Wallsend, Walker, or Jarrow, what do you remember about how a yard fire was reported, and how the brigade got a line onto a ship that had no fixed floor plan? Next on this channel, the Cardiff coal docks, and what coal dust told the crews who worked among it. Back at the scaffold, what did the Dennis's 350 to 400 gallon pump rating actually give Renwick's crew once they were 3 staging levels up a hull with no corridors? And what had to come from somewhere other than the appliance? Before you can understand why a shipyard fire was a different problem from a warehouse fire, you need to understand what a Tyneside yard in this period actually was. Not one building, but a working landscape of half-finished steel wrapped in timber. A hull under construction was staged from keel to deck edge, in wooden scaffolding lashed to the plating, and that timber carried the men, the tools and, critically, the welding and riveting work that put the ship together in the first place. Sparks from hot rivets and welding torches worked directly above and beside oil-soaked decking and dry staging timber for the entire duration of a build, which on a merchant vessel of this period could run to many months. The paint and varnish stores were the second problem, and the more dangerous one. These stores held highly flammable marine coatings in quantity, and yard economics kept them close to the work, beside active bays rather than at a safe remove, because a coating store on the far side of the yard cost a shipwright time he did not have. Renwick had learned, from 6 previous attendances, that when a fire started near a paint store, the first 90 seconds decided almost everything. Whether the store itself had been reached, and whether the fire would stay a hot work fire on open staging, or become a store fire feeding on drums of coating that could not be walked away from once alight. Oxygen and acetylene cylinders, moved from bay to bay as the build progressed, added a hazard with no fixed location at all. The yard's own record of where the cylinders currently stood was often more current than anything the fire brigade held. Period Fire magazine coverage documents that fires in premises combining hot work, timber staging, and flammable liquid storage were treated by fire brigades of this era as a distinct risk category from ordinary industrial premises, requiring the crew to establish cylinder and coating store positions before committing to an interior attack. What did the combination of hot work, timber staging, and nearby paint stores mean for how fast a Wallsend yard fire could change character in its first 90 seconds? And what did Renwick need to know about cylinder positions that no fire station record could reliably give him? The yard foreman's answer to Renwick's question was the same answer Renwick had received 5 times before, and once had received too late. The fire was above the 3rd platform, on the port side, and the nearest cylinder rack had been moved that afternoon to the frame below it. That single piece of information changed the plan Renwick's crew had been forming since they dismounted. It meant the attack line went up the starboard scaffold, not the port, and it meant a second crew member went ahead of the hose to confirm the cylinders were clear before anyone opened a branch near them. This was the specific operational problem that no fire brigade training manual addressed. Because no fire brigade training manual could, a yard changed its own layout weekly, and the only people who reliably knew where things currently stood were the men who worked there. Renwick's crew climbed the starboard scaffold in poor light, on staging built for shipwrights rather than firefighters, carrying a hose line up a structure with no landings, no handrails at working height, and no way to know from below whether the platform above would bear the weight of 2 men and charged hose. The smoke, when they reached the second platform, was thin and pale, cotton waste and varnish rag rather than the timber itself, which told Renwick the fire had not yet taken hold of the staging structure proper. That was the 90 seconds he had been told about. He still had them. What did the yard foreman's single piece of information about the moved cylinder rack change about where Renwick's crew climbed? And what did the thinness and color of the smoke at the second platform tell him about how much of his 90 seconds remained? Sub-Officer Renwick had not been taught how to read a Wallsend hull under construction. He had been taught fire behavior in general terms and building construction in general terms, and he had been given 6 previous opportunities, across 4 years on the Walker substation ground, to learn what those general lessons meant, applied to a specific and constantly changing type of structure. He had learned that thin, pale smoke from rag and waste material meant the fire had not yet reached the staging timber itself, and that once it did, the smoke changed character within minutes. Heavier, darker, and moving faster along the scaffold's own lines rather than simply rising. He had learned that a paint store fire announced itself differently again, with a particular acrid sharpness that reached the nose before it reached the eye. None of this was written in the brigade's training manual, because the manual was written for buildings that stayed the same shape from one attendance to the next. A cotton warehouse Renwick's Ancoats counterparts attended might be the same building on its 10th fire as on its first. A shipyard hull was a different structure every single time a crew was called to it. Different stage of construction, different scaffold configuration, different cylinder positions, sometimes a different vessel entirely on the same slipway. What 6 years had given Renwick was not knowledge of a building, it was a method for extracting, in the first 90 seconds of every attendance, the specific information that a fixed building would simply have already told him. This pattern, operational knowledge built from repeated exposure to a variable structure rather than a fixed one, is documented in Period Fire magazine discussion of shipyard and dockyard fire cover as a distinct professional skill from ordinary structural firefighting. What did Renwick's method for reading a constantly changing structure actually consist of, and what did it cost the brigade in terms of the attendances it took to build it? What a shipyard fire threatened in Wallsend, Jarrow and the other Tyneside yards was not simply a building. It was the single largest employer for entire streets of terraced housing, built specifically to house the men who worked there. When the alarm went, and word passed along the yard that there was fire on the staging, workers on shift gathered at the gate in numbers that had nothing to do with firefighting and everything to do with the fact that a serious fire on a vessel under contract could mean weeks or months of delayed pay if the build was set back, and in the worst case could mean a yard closure that would empty a street of its income entirely. Families in the Wallsend and Jarrow terraces did not need to be told what smoke over the riverbank meant. Many of them could see it from their own back doors, and many of them had a husband, a son, or a father inside the yard gates at the time. This was not spectacle for the people watching from the street. It was the specific, immediate question of whether the yard that fed their household would still be standing and working in the morning. Renwick's crew worked with that audience present in a way that a warehouse fire in a residential district did not always produce, because a shipyard's workforce numbered in the thousands, and its fire risk was, in a very direct sense, the community's economic risk. What did the crowd gathered at the Wallsend yard gate actually represent, in terms of what a serious yard fire meant for the streets around the river, and how did that change what Renwick's crew were protecting beyond the vessel itself? Before you can understand what the Second World War changed about Tyneside's shipyard fire risk, you need to understand that the yards were not incidental targets, they were the target. Swan Hunter's shipyard at Wallsend, the Vickers Armstrong's Naval Yard, and Wallsend Slipway and Engineering Company were named documented objectives for German bombing raids on Newcastle and the Tyne, alongside the river bridges and the Elswick steelworks. This was a river that built warships and merchant tonnage, and the enemy knew it as well as Renwick did. A raid on Newcastle on the 1st of September 1941 produced a fire at New Bridge Street goods station that burned for a week. A documented incident distinct from the shipyards themselves, but evidence of the kind of sustained industrial fire that riverside brigades were now contending with under conditions no peacetime training had anticipated. Incendiaries alongside high-explosive, blackout conditions removing the floodlight Renwick's crews had always worked by, and yard structures now damaged by blast in ways that made the frame number knowledge he had built over 6 pre-war attendances partly unreliable. A hull that had been altered by a bomb was not the hull the yard foreman remembered either. The wartime National Fire Service brought mutual aid and standardized equipment to bear on a scale no individual brigade could have matched alone, but it could not restore the specific, yard-by-yard knowledge that took years to build in peacetime and that a night of bombing could partly erase in minutes. What did the documented targeting of Swan Hunter, the Vickers Armstrong's yard, and Wallsend Slipway during the Blitz mean for the specific yard knowledge Renwick and firefighters like him had spent years building? And what could the National Fire Service's mutual aid provide that it could not replace? What changed the Tyneside shipyard fire risk after the war was not a single regulation, but a slow accumulation of them. Hot work permit systems, introduced across British shipyards through the 1950s and formalised more widely from the 1960s, required a documented sign-off before welding or riveting began in a given bay. Recording, for the first time in a form the fire brigade could actually consult, where hot work was authorized and where flammable storage had to be kept clear of it. Fire watch requirements during welding operations put a dedicated observer on staging specifically to catch a spark before it became a fire, a role that had previously existed only informally, if at all, at the discretion of individual foremen. Yard-based fire arrangements came under national safety inspection from the 1960s, which meant the cylinder position knowledge that Renwick's foremen had once carried in their heads was, increasingly, written down, checked, and available to a crew before they climbed a single scaffold pole. This did not make shipyard fires disappear. It made the specific 90-second problem Renwick had faced at the foot of every scaffold. Where is the fire? Which way out? Where are the cylinders? A problem the paperwork increasingly answered before the crew arrived, rather than a problem the crew had to extract from a foreman under floodlight in the first half-minute of an attendance. Published fire safety and shipbuilding industry regulation histories for this period document the general shift from informal yard practice to documented hot work permit systems as a defining post-war change in industrial fire risk management, consistent with the pattern described here. What did a documented hot work permit and a dedicated fire watch actually remove from the specific problem Renwick had solved by asking a foreman a question in the first 30 seconds of an attendance? And what happened to the value of the knowledge he had spent years building? Sub-Officer George Renwick's Walker substation ground in 1968 was not the ground he had covered in 1938. The yards were bigger, the vessels larger, and the hot work permit and fire watch systems meant that a crew arriving at a Tyneside shipyard fire increasingly found the answer to Renwick's old first question: where, which way out, where are the cylinders? Already written on a board at the yard gate. This was, by any fair measure, a safer arrangement than 6 firefighters extracting that information from a foreman under floodlight in 90 seconds. It was not sentimental to say so, and it would be dishonest to argue otherwise. If this channel is going to keep documenting what British firefighters knew about the buildings they entered, and what that knowledge cost to acquire, there are more appliances, more divisions, more watch systems, more smoke columns read from the cab of a Dennis at 2 in the morning, and more 90-second problems solved by a single question to a foreman that were never written down anywhere and that kept a Wallsend hull standing in 1938. What 7 years of Wallsend yard attendances gave Sub-Officer Renwick was not in the Dennis Big Four's pump rating or the training manual. It was the specific knowledge of which frame numbers on a part-built hull led back to open air, and what happened to that knowledge when hot work permits and fire watch rules took the guesswork out of the yards after the war. And if you have an incident, a station, a watch, a yard, put it in the comments. If you or your family worked in the Tyneside shipyards or served with Newcastle City Fire Brigade covering the riverside yards at Wallsend, Walker or Jarrow, what do you remember about how a yard fire was reported and how the brigade got a line onto a ship that had no fixed floor plan? Next on this channel, the Cardiff coal docks, and what coal dust told the crews who worked among it. The last of the yards Renwick had covered as a young sub-officer changed hands, merged, or closed across the reorganizations that reshaped Tyneside shipbuilding from the 1960s onward. What the permit system and the fire watch rota gave the yards. A documented, checkable record of exactly the information Renwick had once had to ask for. What it did not need, the specific years of climbing unfamiliar staging in poor light to learn, attendance by attendance, which questions to ask, and in what order. The knowledge went where Renwick went when he retired. The yards did not ask him to leave it behind, because by then they no longer needed it in the same form. Nobody had written it down. There had never been anywhere to write it.